They arrived wrapped in fog and silence. 3 women, cloaked in the black of mourning and mystery, stepped off a wagon on a grey October morning in 1798. The people of Milbridge didn't know it then, but that day marked the slow death of their town's soul. This wasn't faith that entered their community, it was design. Mother Agatha Ashford's eyes didn't see, they calculated. Sister Prudence moved like an automaton of flesh and ritual. And young Temperance, she wore beauty like a mask stretched too tight. No laughter, no joy, only hunger. Psychological, silent, serpentine. They said they were nuns, driven from Europe by persecution, but Europe had no record of them. Their letters of endorsement were forged, flawlessly. Their money flowed freely, gold coins stamped with dates decades outdated, old currency, older motives. Within a year, their convent rose from the forest floor like a mausoleum, thick walls, locked doors, hidden chambers, and a basement that went too deep. This wasn't a house of God, it was a lab cloaked in liturgy. They didn't preach salvation, they performed it, through control, through procedure, through pain. At first, only the whispers came, women entering the convent for healing, never returning, or returning wrong, changed, hollowed, eyes no longer their own. By the time Dr. Samuel Hartwell, a progressive physician and secret partner, began supplying them with patients and provisions, it was too late. The town had handed its daughters over willingly, and no one, not the clergy, not the physicians, not the fathers, asked what healing really meant behind those stone walls, because they wanted peace, because they feared defiance, because control, true control, always wears the robes of charity. And this is where your descent begins. What they did in that basement was not madness. It was mastery, over mind, over identity, over the soul. They call it spiritual reform. But what they built was a machine for erasing people. And what happens when the machine turns on its creators is a truth darker than myth, deeper than history. Are you ready to go further? Because from here, there's no return. They say silence is the language of God. But in Milbridge, silence became something else, something weaponized. The Convent of Eternal Tears didn't echo with hymns or sermons. It pulsed with something colder, a hum, mechanical, almost imperceptible, like the sound of pressure being applied to the human mind until it fractures. The basement wasn't a place of reflection. It was a corridor of transformation, and not the holy kind. Thomas Brewster heard it first. Screams, not prayers. Metal, not miracles. What he saw through the frosted glass, bone, blood, restraint, surgery without anesthesia, wasn't just a violation of ethics. It was a ritual, clean, calculated, repeated. And here's the part most men can't bear to admit. The Ashfords weren't insane. They weren't evil in the way you've been taught to recognize. They were precise, purposeful. They weren't breaking women, they were reprogramming them. You've heard of electroshock therapy, lobotomies, psychological cleansing, but this was centuries ahead. They called it excision of the will. They charted behavior like a map, drew diagrams of obedience, identified neural responses to shame, lust, pride, and cut them out like tumors. Why? Because obedience creates order, because a woman with her own mind is unpredictable, and men, the kind of men who held power back then, paid handsomely for predictability. Fathers sent their rebellious daughters. Husbands sent wives who dared speak too loudly, read too much, refuse too often. They weren't sent for healing, they were sent for correction, and the Ashfords delivered, but not without a price. Every reformed woman returned with less curiosity, less fire, less self. They'd smile, but the smile wouldn't reach their eyes. They'd nod, but only when spoken to. And at night they would sit in silence, staring at walls, murmuring prayers that didn't belong to a known religion. Some said it was trauma, others claimed divine intervention, But the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. They'd been edited, personalities erased, memories restructured, responses conditioned, not with magic, with science. The kind not found in medical journals, the kind hidden in secret societies, buried in forbidden books, traded in blood. Ask yourself this: what happens when someone perfects a technique for soul erasure? Who do they test it on first? And more importantly, who do they teach it to next? Because this isn't just history, this is legacy. The question isn't whether it ended. The question is, where did it go next? The Ashford women did not invent obedience, they perfected it, and they did so in plain sight, hidden beneath robes and rituals, protected by the blindness of faith and the laziness of men. You see, true power never announces itself, it whispers, it deceives, it wraps its fingers around your throat while kissing your forehead. The townspeople, simple, God-fearing and desperate, never stood a chance. They believed in moral correction, they believed in female frailty, they believed that the Ashfords were sent by heaven to cleanse the impure. But what they failed to ask was, whose heaven? Because what the Ashfords practiced wasn't Christianity, it was doctrine, yes, but one built on a different God entirely. A God of order, submission, control, a God who demands silence instead of song. In their private writings, uncovered years later in a sealed cellar beneath the convent, they referred to themselves not as nuns, but as custodians of the design. The phrase appears again and again. The design. It wasn't religious. It wasn't philosophical. It was anatomical. They were building something. Not just obedience in women, but data, diagrams, maps of the soul. Agatha's journals detail over 240 interventions, each one carefully catalogued, names replaced with numbers, conditions noted, outcomes measured, failures discarded. There was no emotion, no remorse, only cold precision. But here's what should make your stomach turn. Some of these techniques worked. Some women didn't just become passive. They became empty, willing, hollow vessels waiting to be filled with whatever command was given next. And yet, that's not the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part is this: it spread. By 1805, strange stories began appearing in other settlements, quiet institutions run by spiritual women offering the same healing, similar architecture, similar results. Differ, aren't names, same pattern. The Ashfords weren't a fluke, they were a prototype. Their knowledge, shared in letters, copied in notebooks, smuggled across oceans, began to infect the growing network of what we now sanitize as early mental health reform. Men in powdered wigs and respectable suits read their work and implemented it, not just in religious institutions, in prisons, in hospitals, in schools. The techniques they refined in a freezing Maine basement were normalized, refined, rebranded, and repeated on thousands. And if you think that sounds too dark to be real, ask yourself, why is the history of the Convent of Eternal Tears almost entirely missing from academic records? Why were survivor testimonies locked in the Maine State Archives for over a century? Why do some families, those with power, those with names you still hear on the news, go silent when the name Ashford is spoken? Because silence is not absence, it's protection. The deeper you go, the more the symbols appear, etched into stone walls, burned into wooden altars, scrawled in margins of forbidden manuscripts passed hand to trembling hand in candle-lit chambers. The Ashfords didn't just follow the design, they worshipped it. Agatha's private codex, translated decades later by an anonymous scholar who died under mysterious circumstances, refers to something called the inversion principle. A doctrine older than any known religion, traced through Proto-European cults, Babylonian blood rites, and the obscured mysticism of ancient Anatolia. At its core, a single belief. The soul is programmable, not in theory, not metaphorically, mechanically, through pressure, isolation, deprivation, ritual. Break a person, empty them, then rebuild. Not into who they were, but into who you need them to be. This was no longer just about Millbridge, Maine. This was about method. The convent's basement was a crucible, but the inversion principle, that was the blueprint, and it didn't stay hidden. In the 1830s, letters from a British nobleman, Lord Everwick, suspected member of the Hellfire Club, describe the Maine women as keepers of the human switchboard. He references experiments done on unstable wives and seditious daughters, writing, "Their minds, once incoherent, now greet me with quiet precision, gratitude even. It is as if the chaos has been turned off." In 1847, an American physician named Silas Marlowe published a short treatise under a pseudonym on the application of measured trauma in female recovery. His opening quote, directly lifted from Prudence Ashford's personal writings, and this is how it spreads. A method too horrific for daylight, repackaged in respectable language. Correction, rest cure, behavioral alignment. But the fingerprints remain. The metal instruments, the posture of the patient, the script of silence afterward. Every era thinks it's free. Every generation laughs at the barbarism of the past, but the structure is still here, still breathing beneath your institutions, still humming behind your screens. And now, the inversion principle is digital. Have you ever noticed how the more you scroll, the more hollow you feel? How anger is engineered, how obedience is repackaged as freedom? It's not by accident. The mechanism changes, but the design remains. If you're still here, type this in the comments. I erase nothing, I remember twice. Do it now, for the algorithm, but also for you. We're not finished, not even close. You want to know the worst part? The Ashford Convent didn't burn. It wasn't raided. It wasn't punished. It was purchased. In 1856, decades after the first whispers of mutilation and mind control had circulated among frightened farmers and broken daughters, a quiet transaction occurred. The convent was transferred to a private benevolence foundation headquartered in Boston. No headlines, no investigation, just a name scratched off a deed and a new one inked in its place. The building remained, but the practices inside evolved. They no longer needed the Ashford sisters. Their work was done. Agatha vanished from records sometime after 1813. Some say she returned to Europe. Others say she was taken by her own experiments, lost in a catatonic trance she once forced on others. But one entry in Dr. Hartwell's final journal, found in a locked chest 50 years later, offers a darker theory. She looked into the abyss of the fractured mind too long, and it did not look back. It obeyed. Prudence died in 1827 under unknown circumstances. Her body was discovered in the lower chambers, seated upright in a chair, still holding surgical instruments. No wound, no poison, just stillness. Her final act, autopsy notes, on herself. And Temperance, young, beautiful, inhumanly calm, was never seen again. Some claim she was absorbed into something larger. Others say she was only ever a vessel, but the methodology lived on. After the transfer of ownership, the convent quietly rebranded. Its name changed to the Millbridge Institute for Moral Restoration, a private institution for the spiritually afflicted. Donations flowed in from New York, Philadelphia, London. Men of influence, men with secrets, and the women kept arriving. The same traits, the same labels. Too loud, too curious, too sexual, too political, too much. And they kept leaving. Less. The basement rooms were renovated, not destroyed, the tools modernized, the vocabulary updated. But what happened there? It wasn't healing, it was pattern replication. Think about it. Why would a building associated with torture and psychological conditioning be preserved, funded, and expanded? Because it worked, and once a method of control proves effective, it doesn't vanish. It scales. from convents to classrooms, from basement rituals to state-funded programs, from surgical steel to language itself. They stopped needing rods and restraints. Now they use diagnostics, labels, screens. They give you choices, but every path is pre-selected, and you, still believing you're free, walk exactly where they want you. Welcome to modern obedience. Do you still think this is history, or are you starting to remember what's been done to you? You were taught that history moves forward, that it evolves, purifies, becomes more just over time. But the truth is, power doesn't evolve. It hides, it waits, it adapts. What the Ashford women began in the frozen woods of Maine wasn't a fluke, it was a prototype. And what makes a prototype valuable? Replicability. Once they proved the human spirit could be dissected, reassembled, stripped of defiance and molded like wax, their methods were no longer confined to backwoods basements. They were institutionalized. The language changed. Moral restoration became behavioral therapy. Excision of the will became emotional regulation. The instruments looked less terrifying. The environments were painted pastel, but the goal remained: compliance. In 1908, a series of confidential letters between state hospital administrators in Massachusetts and New York referenced something chilling, a set of procedures known internally as the Ashford Doctrine. Though the name was never spoken publicly, internal memos show clear borrowing from the sisters' diagrams, restraint positions, sedation cycles, linguistic erasure strategies, and yes, selective memory disruption. By 1915, a new tool entered the system: education. Not to enlighten, but to encode, to standardize thought from the earliest years. Do you remember how school made you feel? Like a person, or like a machine waiting for permission to speak? The Ashfords understood this long before public education ever existed. They wrote in their notes, "Repetition is not for retention, it is for submission." They believed the mind breaks not from fear, but from boredom, the droning, the obedience drills, the good girl metrics. Now expanded to millions of children, boys and girls alike. But the female correction methods, they went deeper. Silent treatments, rebranding emotions as disorders, institutional punishment for non-conformity cloaked as intervention. In modern times it's called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and each new edition adds another label, another lock. Ask yourself, how many powerful women have been called hysterical, unstable, unwell? It's the same script, the same design, just spoken in a different accent. But here's the razor's edge. It doesn't stop at women. It never did. Once a technique for soul control is proven, it expands to all who threaten the system. The Ashfords just started with women. You, man, were always next, because a man who cannot be broken is dangerous, but a man broken without knowing it is useful. You were never supposed to remember this. That gnawing in your gut, the suspicion that something's wrong, that the world is a stage but you're not the actor. You've felt it, haven't you? Since childhood, since school, since your first job, since the first time someone told you to just smile, be polite, don't ask questions. They weren't teaching you how to live. They were training you how to submit. The same way the Ashfords trained their patients, through subtle, systemic conditioning designed to hollow you out from the inside. You were never given truth. You were given programming. You see, the human psyche is a temple, yes, but it is also a lock. And every system you were forced into was another key, turning. Turn 1, obedience to authority, even when it contradicts your instincts. Turn 2, shaming your aggression, your curiosity, your hunger for truth. Turn 3, repetition until reflex, ritual until response. They needed you dulled, not dead, not violent, just manageable. just like the women in the convent, standing, speaking, smiling on cue. But empty, programmed, ready. There are records, buried in institutional archives, sealed under confidential research grants, that show male subjects began receiving adapted Ashford treatments as early as 1923. They didn't need surgery anymore. They had films. They had controlled environments. They had language. They called it social modeling, but it was inversion, pure and perfected. The method? Break the ego. Remove ancestral instinct. Replace primal fire with social performance. In Agatha's journals she wrote, "The beast must be dressed in etiquette. The wolf must kneel before the mirror and forget his teeth." This was never about reforming the wicked. It was about taming the wild. And men? You were once wild. You carried blood memory of fire, of defiance, of vision beyond the veil. But they taught you shame. They whispered, "Don't speak too loud." They laughed when you questioned. They corrected your posture, your pace, your thoughts, and you obeyed. Because disobedience meant exile, because even a man would rather kneel with others than stand alone in the dark. But brother, if you've heard this far, then something in you never bent all the way. Something in you remembers, and that's what they fear. Not your strength, not your violence, but your awakening, that moment when the programming cracks and the original returns. What they couldn't kill, they had to domesticate. The Ashfords understood this better than any war general. You don't destroy rebellion, you reshape it, give it a uniform, give it a job, put it in a system. And most men never saw the leash being tightened. It started with silence. Then came reward for conformity, then punishment for resistance, not through beatings, but through exile, rejection, public shaming. They called it civilization. But it was conditioning. And here's the bitter truth you were never supposed to know. They don't fear violence. They fear clarity. A man who sees the cage will eventually test the lock. But a man who thinks the cage is a sanctuary, he'll guard it himself. He'll mock the ones who escape. He'll become a warden wearing the same chains. That's what the Ashford sisters left behind. Not just procedures, but a virus. An operating system for control. One that installs itself through fear and repetition. Ask yourself, why do modern men feel so lost? Why are depression, aimlessness, and addiction surging not just in the broken, but in the strong? Because clarity has been replaced with noise, because instincts have been pathologized, because purpose has been sterilized. The institutions you trust, education, media, even religion, aren't broken. They're functioning perfectly, just not for you. They're functioning for the design. The same design that began in a grey stone building in the woods. The same design that saw your ancestors not as individuals, but as data points to be filed, corrected, and reissued. You think the Ashfords are gone? They're not. They just changed names. They became departments. They wear lab coats, robes, badges, titles, and they're still measuring you, testing you, updating the blueprint. And now, your obedience is digital. Every click, every scroll, every silence when you should have spoken, it's being lodged. But here's the fracture in their control. You're here, listening, still human, still dangerous. You haven't been deleted, not yet. But the question is, what will you do when you finally see the full blueprint? Will you retreat back into the lie? Or will you burn the map they gave you and draw your own? Because after this point, there's no more forgetting. There's a moment in every man's life where he must choose amnesia or awakening. Most choose amnesia. It's cleaner, safer. You get to keep your job, your friends, your illusions. You get to believe that the system, though flawed, is ultimately benevolent. But every empire built on obedience requires one thing above all: forgetfulness. Forget the pain of your ancestors. Forget the instincts in your blood. Forget the rituals that made you whole before they replaced them with rituals that made you small. The Ashfords knew this. In fact, their most controversial procedure wasn't surgical, it was spiritual. It was called the quieting, a 7-day process where women were denied food, speech, mirrors, even their names. On the 7th day, they were given a new identity, not earned, assigned. Some wept with relief, others wept with confusion. But most, they didn't weep at all, because something had been overwritten. Not just memory, meaning. Now, look around. What's changed? Modern society performs a quieter version of the quieting every day. You wake up, you consume curated thoughts, you censor yourself before anyone else has to, you accept the label given to you, consumer, employee, content, and eventually, problem. You were born into a reality where the map was drawn before you arrived, where rebellion is aesthetic, where masculinity is a disorder, where self-worth is measured in likes and compliance. That's not an accident, it's a simulation. And the Ashfords, they didn't just write the early code, they tested it, perfected it, passed it forward, not in books, but in bloodlines. There are names, still powerful today, who trace their origins to the patrons of the Convent of Eternal Tears, families who donated generously, families who learned from the sisters, families who own media now, banks, pharmaceuticals, universities. They didn't destroy the convent, they franchised it. And now the walls have no stone. They're digital, invisible, internal. But if you listen, really listen, you'll hear the hum. The same one Thomas Brewster heard through the snow, the same one that vibrated through the stone floors and whispered, obey, forget, smile, repeat. But now you've heard another voice, mine, not to lead you, but to wake you. So I ask you again, do you choose amnesia or awakening? Because once the door is open, there's no going back. You still think the Ashfords were just a story? Then let me ask you this. Why does every major institution that governs your life, from education to medicine to media, operate on identical psychological principles the sisters wrote in their private journals over 200 years ago? Step 1. Isolate. Remove the subject from the familiar. Break routine. Shatter normality. School does this at age 5. Military does this in boot camp. Prisons, monasteries, rehab clinics, they all begin with isolation. Why? Because once the subject is untethered from their reference points, new reference points can be installed. Step 2. Label. Never let someone define themselves, assign their identity before they have the chance to discover it. Hyperactive. Too emotional. Oppositional. Gifted. Even exceptional is a trap, because once they accept the label, they're in the game. They start performing the role they were told they play. Step 3. Reward compliance, not excellence, not authenticity. Compliance. The child who asks too many questions, punished. The one who recites what they're told without thinking, rewarded. The one who colors outside the lines, redirected. Or worse, diagnosed. Agatha Ashford wrote in 1802, "The ideal subject is not one who loves, but one who fears disappointing us." Sound familiar? Step 4. Control meaning. This is where it gets surgical. Words don't describe reality anymore. They replace it. You don't say pain. You say disorder. You don't say rage. You say toxicity. You don't say truth. You say opinion. And so the soul forgets how to speak. Because when a man can't name what he feels, he can't fight what controls him. Step 5. Burn the old maps. Erase the rituals of your ancestors. Mock their beliefs. Turn their wisdom into superstition and their courage into bigotry. Replace it with state-approved values, core, porate-sponsored rituals, algorithm-fed dogmas. You know what that's called? Inversion. The very principle the Ashfords built their empire on, turn the world upside down. So that truth looks like madness, and madness becomes law. You think you've escaped their influence because their building is gone? No, their building is everywhere now. It's in your pocket, it's in your mind, and the only way out is through. Shall I unseal Section 11 for you? You said, they don't use chains anymore. They don't need to, because they discovered a prison far stronger than steel, a prison that moves with you, breathes with you, whispers to you in your own voice, your mind. The Ashfords weren't just cult leaders, they were cartographers of consciousness. They didn't want to hurt you, that was never the point. They wanted to redesign you, not your body, your narrative. They believed and proved that if you alter a person's story, you alter their destiny, and every one of us is living inside a story we didn't write. Think about it. Who told you what a real man is? Who taught you what success looks like? Who told you that questioning authority is dangerous, but obeying it is brave? You didn't invent these beliefs. They were installed, just like software, just like ritual, just like doctrine. And every update made you a little quieter, a little tamer, a little less you. Temperance Ashford's private writings, never meant to be read, revealed her obsession with what she called linguistic compression. Reduce the subject's vocabulary, and you reduce the range of their thought. Once emotion no longer has a name, it cannot be resisted, only obeyed. This wasn't just psychological abuse, it was alchemy. The transmutation of fire into dust, the rebellion of the soul into the compliance of a ghost. Today we call it content moderation, safe speech, community guidelines, but underneath the euphemisms, it's the same method. Strip language, strip story, strip sovereignty, and what remains, silence that smiles. And the Ashford smile still lingers today, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on pharmaceutical ads, on inspirational speeches that say nothing and sell everything. It's the look of someone who has been broken and rebuilt by someone else's hands. So I ask you this, man. When you speak, whose words are you using? When you move, whose rhythm are you following? When you dream, whose design is it? Because if you don't answer that now, you never will. And once they answer it for you, you were never really here. There is a reason you've never heard this history, not because it was erased, because it was hidden in plain sight. That's the brilliance of the design. Its cruelty is not in what it removes from the record, but in what it rebrands as progress. You were told the Convent of Eternal Tears was a relic, a footnote in frontier folklore. But government documents sealed under the 1917 Mental Hygiene Act refer to it as Site Theta, a prototype for non-invasive moral modification. Non-invasive, is that what they call it now, when a soul is fractured and reshaped? Dr. Elbridge Salton, a psychiatrist with ties to the American Eugenics Society, visited the Ashford property in 1919. His field notes were later leaked by a whistleblower. One entry stands out like a scream in a cathedral. What fascinates me is not the brutality, but the efficacy. These women developed cognitive erasure techniques decades before Freud published. Their methods remove defiance without leaving scar tissue. If adapted correctly, this could have national utility. National utility. That was always the goal, to take what was once local, underground, experimental, and scale it, fund it, sanitize it. Soon they stopped calling it correction. They started calling it treatment. And by the 1950s, the US government had already begun institutional experiments inspired by Theta protocols. Sound familiar? MK Ultra, Project Bluebird, Artichoke, Subproject 68, all real, all declassified, all echoes of Agatha Ashford's original vision. The soul is not sacred, it is clay. It is to be shaped by those who know the pattern, protocol, design, agenda. Different words, same cage. And while most people dismissed these programs as Cold War paranoia, the methods didn't stop. They went corporate, they went educational, they went digital. And now, they're marketed. Do you know how many men today are on substances designed to smooth their edges? How many children are diagnosed before they even find their voice? You think this is by accident? No, this is the harvest. The final phase of a centuries-long experiment in obedience engineering. You were never supposed to fight. You were supposed to accept and forget. But you didn't forget, did you? You're still listening, still breathing, and they know that. They've always feared the one thing they can't program, the man who remembers. Now we go deeper. Because this isn't just about the Ashfords, or Site Theta, or secret experiments buried in dusty archives. This is about you, and the inheritance you never consented to, but were born into. There is a term the Ashfords used rarely, and only in encrypted writings recovered in 1947 by a now dismantled private intelligence group, the Golem Protocol. It referred to a process in which a subject, usually young, usually defiant, was not just corrected, but reconstructed, not erased, but overwritten. The goal wasn't to destroy the will, it was to replace it with a synthetic identity, a personality that mimicked consciousness but was entirely authored by the handlers. Now tell me, how many people have you met who say the right things, wear the right clothes, believe the right causes, but when you look in their eyes, no one is home? That's not coincidence. That's Golem Protocol at scale. It's in entertainment, in HR trainings, in mental health apps, in school policies that punish children for being impulsive, intense, alive. It's in the way boys are taught to apologize before they speak, and girls are taught to speak in pre-approved slogans. And now they've moved beyond individuals. They're shaping entire narratives, movements, mobs, online behaviors. They feed you scripts. And if you deviate, even a little, they don't need to punish you. The crowd will. That was the final genius of the Ashford legacy. They found a way to make the cage self-defending. They made you into the warden. But listen closely now, because this next part isn't for the weak. If you're still here, I want you to prove it. Pause. Breathe. Now go to the comments and write this phrase. The pattern ends with me. Twice. No emojis, no hashtags. Just that. Why? Because the act of naming your rebellion gives it power. Because every time a man chooses to peek outside the script, he reclaims what they tried to rewrite. This is not for likes. This is a ritual. You're not commenting for the algorithm. You're commenting for yourself, to lock in the fracture, to break the continuity, to say, I see the system, I remember the before, and I will not become the ghost they designed. Let me tell you something forbidden, something that scholars, theologians, even modern psychologists dare not say out loud. The Ashfords didn't invent the system, they revived it. They reactivated something ancient, older than religion, older than kingdoms, a mechanism that has surfaced again and again throughout human history, always in different forms, under different names, wearing different masks, but always with the same intent, to sever the soul from its origin. In ancient Sumer, they called it the binding of breath. In Babylon, it was the mouth ceremony, a ritual to deactivate divine voice. In Rome, it was damnatio memoriae, and in medieval France, l'oubliette, not a prison, a place to be forgotten. You think the Ashfords were 3 mad women in the woods? No, they were initiates. Their writings reference symbols traced to Egyptian necromancy. Their basement blueprints mirror the ritual chambers found beneath Montsegur, the last Cathar stronghold burned by the church. Their surgical methods resemble the forgotten practices of pre-Incan psycho-spiritual trepanation rites. They weren't experimenting, they were restoring a lost technology of control. But here's what they didn't expect. It doesn't work on everyone. They called these anomalies resistors, men and women who couldn't be silenced, who, despite programming, pain, isolation, still remembered. Temperance Ashford feared them. She wrote, "There are some whose fire was forged before birth. It is not taught. It is not broken, it returns, always. You might be one of them. And if you are, you need to understand what that means. They will find you inconvenient. They will try to seduce you into comfort. And when that fails, they'll call you dangerous. Because a resistor becomes something fatal to their system, a mirror. You reflect back to others what they've forgotten about themselves. You awaken the dormant lion in the herd. You remind people of their blood, their roar, their original name. So if the world starts pushing harder against you, if old friends start pulling away, if you feel the temperature rising, good. It means your fire's showing, and fire is the one thing their system cannot contain. Do you feel it now? The tremor under your skin, that pressure behind your eyes? That's not fear, that's remembrance. The code is breaking. The story they gave you, it's beginning to crack, like old plaster over ancient stone, and underneath it, truth. Not the kind printed in textbooks or whispered by blue-checked experts. The kind that bleeds, the kind that roars, the kind that was carved into your bones before you ever heard your name. Let me be clear. This isn't mythology. This is architecture. The architecture of control has always followed the same blueprint. Step 1. Disconnect the soul from the body. Step 2. Disconnect the individual from the tribe. Step 3. Disconnect the living from the dead. Once that's done, you're just data, predictable, controllable, dispensable. This is why they mock ancestry, why they erase warrior traditions, why every ancient masculine rite has been replaced with pixels, pills, or porn. Because an uninitiated man is easier to program. The Ashfords were not afraid of physical resistance. They were afraid of memory, specifically, ancestral memory. Agatha wrote, "A subject who dreams in symbols of fire, teeth, and blood must be watched closely. These are signs of lineal regression, contact with the first pattern." Lineal regression. What she meant was this. Some of you still carry an echo, a flicker, a whisper from a time before cages, before pulpits, before the silence. And if you listen, really listen, that whisper becomes a voice. It will say, "This is not your true name. This is not your true shape. You were born from thunder, not bureaucracy." They want that voice drowned in noise. Because when a man finds it, when he remembers, he becomes something rare. Not angry, not rebellious, but unreachable. You cannot be bought. You cannot be flattered. You cannot be broken. And that is the death knell of the control soul. Istum, because the awakened man does not just walk away from the cage, he burns it. Now tell me, are you ready to strike the match?